Ever feel like someone is working against you? Watch as Steve Poe discusses who's on your side and who's not. You know, we do have an enemy who works against us. He is Satan, and he is out to steal, kill, and destroy. But we also have God on our side, and Satan is no match for him. We may have battles where we're living on this earth, but in the end, the fight is going to be worth it because in the end, God wins. It's important to know our enemies so that we know how to stand against him.
I thought I would start today as we jump in to our message today by reading to you all the Christmas story found in Revelation chapter 12. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Wow. Is that how you remember the Christmas story? Is that the story you'd like to read to your kiddos on Christmas Eve morning? Probably not. But if you've been a Christian for very long, you've heard the Christmas story told from a variety of perspectives. You've probably heard it told from the perspective of Mary or from Joseph maybe, or you've heard it from the perspective of the shepherds or maybe the wise men. Maybe you even heard it from the perspective of the innkeeper who didn't have room for Jesus in the inn. But have you ever heard it from the perspective of heaven? Have you ever heard it from the perspective of the upper story? This perspective is not found in the Gospels, but it's found in the book of Revelation. In chapter 12 of Revelation, we experience a heavenly flashback to that very first Christmas. The flashback looks back to the birth of Jesus, which probably occurred about 80 years before John had this vision. This flashback kind of lifts the curtain and shows John and us what's going on in the upper story during the birth of Christ. Of course, the lower story here is Joseph and Mary headed to Bethlehem because of a census and giving birth to the Messiah in a stable because there was no room for them in the inn. While in the upper story, Satan or the dragon is trying to keep the child or Jesus, the Messiah, from being born. We don't ever think about that. We just think about the lower story and the story of Christmas. But in the upper story, Satan very much was trying to destroy the child, trying to devour the child. Chapter 12 actually is one of the most crucial chapters to Revelation because it tells us of the agenda of Satan, and it will help us to better understand what the tribulation period is all about. Notice it says that a great sign appeared in heaven. In other words, this scene is symbolic. It didn't actually happen, but like other symbols in the book of Revelation, it represents reality. So we see this 7-headed dragon, and we're like, oh, are you kidding me? You know, it's like, that's why I don't read Revelation. This is crazy stuff. It's sci-fi. Well, first of all, it's upper story. That's what's going on in the spirit realm. But secondly, it's purely symbolic. It just represents what's actually happening in the spirit realm. Basically, this is a parenthetical enlargement that he wants us to see that the tribulation, listen, the tribulation is a consummation of the cosmic battle between God and Satan that's been going on in the upper story since the revolt of Lucifer. It reminds us that Satan has tried to stop the first coming of the Messiah, and he is also trying to stop his second coming. And I want us to look at the characters in this scene. First of all, we read, you have the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Now, there's a lot of different opinions as to who this woman represents, but if we were to let the Bible interpret itself, you can see, even in the Old Testament, the imagery comes right out of Joseph's second dream. I don't mean Joseph and Mary, I mean Old Testament Joseph. Back in Genesis, we've studied this before. And if you remember, Joseph has two dreams. The second dream, it says, then he had another dream and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. At this time, the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? So the woman in Revelation most likely represents the nation of Israel. It most likely represents the nation of Israel. And the focus would be on God using the nation of Israel to bring his son, the Messiah, into the world. And yet others argue and say, well, no, Steve, you've said it's the Christmas story. The woman represents Mary. And I believe that's true. It does represent Mary. She's the only pregnant one to give birth to the Messiah, to Jesus. But what I think it's also important to understand is that it's bigger than Mary. We have to realize the preparation for the coming of the Messiah, for the coming of Jesus, began long before Mary became the final representative of the godly woman in Israel. Certainly, Mary represents all of that, but it's even bigger than that. The second character in this vision is a child. The child that's born to the woman, which clearly is a reference to the birth of Jesus. Jesus is presented here as king, a child who's destined to rule the nations with an iron scepter. And the word to rule the nations, and the word rule here in verse 5 is actually the verb to shepherd. When it says to rule the nations, it means he's to shepherd the nations. It presents Jesus as the true shepherd, the true guide and leader who can lead the nations to peace and freedom. Now, guys, a shepherd is a leader who is tender and loving in his leadership, a leader who guides instead of forces. And yet he leads, it says, with a rod of iron, which refers to his power and authority as the rightful king. The iron scepter balances out the imagery of a shepherd and a king. Jesus is both tender and firm, caring and just. And then the end of verse 5 skips from the birth of Jesus to his ascension when he returned to heaven after his death and resurrection. And so by mentioning the birth of Jesus and then the ascension of Jesus, John is linking together his entire life. This is why, this is a way of presenting the entire work of Christ as a comprehensive work. Jesus was born into the world, lived a perfect life, died a sacrificial death for our sins on Good Friday, rose from the grave on Easter Sunday, and then ascended to heaven in the sight of his followers, promising that one day he would return again. So this vision views the work of Christ comprehensively as one total work that involved his birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension. The third major character in this vision is this grotesque seven-headed dragon. Again, I know it's wild, I know it's weird, but here the dragon is what John calls a sign. He calls him a sign, which a sign means the dragon is just symbolic of something else. And again, we'll see that as we read on. Let's read on verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. There we go, the dragon. So you're going to see that the dragon is Satan. The angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. So you see, it identifies for us who this is. It's symbolic of Satan, so it tells us that, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. It's identified, the dragon is identified as Satan or the devil, so now we see the action in heaven is going to resume. We're in the middle of the tribulation period, and Satan tries again to take over the throne of God, and the result, of course, is a war in heaven. And of course, without question, Satan is going to lose that battle, and he's thrown down to the earth, and his access to heaven is once again cut off. Listen, it's certainly true, Jesus told us that Satan is out to steal, kill, and destroy. We know that's his motivation. That's his motivation for every single one of us in this room. But what you also have to understand, my friends, is that Satan is no match for God. Absolutely no match for God. Revelation shows us in the end, again, we win. We win. So we read on, verse 10. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers, who accused them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. So Satan is the accuser of the brethren. What does that mean? It means he's a liar. He makes accusations that are untrue. He's been hurled down. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. Satan knows his time is short. And so that's why I believe more than anything, he's trying to ramp up his efforts. He's trying to do whatever he can to deceive as many people as he possibly can. Verse 13, it goes on. And it says, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Now, what is that saying? What that's saying, in other words, is he persecuted the Jewish people. Again, the woman represents Israel. He persecuted the Jewish people who gave birth to the Messiah. All right? So now we're going to jump on. We're moving quickly, but we're going to jump on into chapter 13. And in this chapter is still a part of the interlude between the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals, and it begins to describe the reign of the Antichrist. So look at verse 1. And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, and you're like, oh my gosh, here we go again. It's symbolic. It's symbolic. With 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard. The beast he's talking about is the Antichrist. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. All right? So at this point it says, and that was really important, I should have pointed that out. Satan gave the Antichrist his power, his throne, and his authority. What does that mean? Satan possesses the Antichrist. The Antichrist is possessed by the devil. He gives him his power and authority. It's not his own power, but in fact, Satan, as I said, will possess him. So the first thing Satan does is he motivates the Antichrist to launch this great persecution of the woman who gave birth to the male child. Who did we say that was? Israel. So the Antichrist picks up where Hitler left off with a campaign to destroy the Jewish people. Now, I've showed you this before. In fact, I think I read it to you again last week, but I want you to remember Daniel chapter 9. He will confirm, the Antichrist will confirm a covenant with many for 7 years. So we're talking about the 7-year tribulation period. The Antichrist is going to confirm a covenant with the Jewish people so that the Jewish people can rebuild their temple, go back in and worship their God. In the middle of the 7, 3.5 years in, he will put an end to the sacrifice and offering. He'll say, no more. You can't worship your God anymore. And on a wing of the temple, he will set up, this is important, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. Most likely, it's some type of a statue of himself. He's going to set up this statue and say, you're not going to worship your God anymore, you're going to worship me. And this is what the idol that you'll worship. Until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. According to Daniel, the Antichrist will launch this Holocaust by marching into the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, and he'll stop all the sacrifices and set up this abomination of desolation, which is probably a statue of himself. The Jews, of course, are going to be horrified by these actions, and they're going to revolt. And this, of course, will cause the Antichrist to launch an all-out attack against Jews worldwide. And his purpose will be to kill every last one of them. Now, keep in mind, Satan hates the Jews. Satan hates the Jews. He hates them because they were God's chosen people and because they gave us the Messiah. Another reason Satan hates the Jews is because God has promised to save a remnant of the Jewish people at the end of the tribulation period, and Satan does not want to see God fulfill that promise. As we said, the Antichrist is empowered by Satan, and he immediately begins to blaspheme God, just as Daniel told us that he would. We read on, chapter 13, verse 5. The beast, Antichrist, was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them, and he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. For 42 months, 3.5 years, the second half of the 7-year tribulation period. So the beast continues to use his power, authority to make war with the saints. It says that he was given authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. In other words, he becomes history's first true worldwide dictator. Verse 8. There's more I could say on that, but I just got to stay away from it. You know what I mean? Verse 8. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. The Antichrist becomes the object of worldwide worship. He demands it. He demands it. He requires it, and people will worship him. We're going to see there are two prominent figures that come on the scene during the second half of the tribulation period. Okay, so verse 11. It says, then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb. And you say, well, there it is again. It's symbolic. But he spoke like a dragon. Okay? So what in the world are we talking about? We're introduced to another beast who rises up out of the earth or the land. Just as the sea is prophetic symbol for the Gentile nations, the land is symbolic of Israel. So many believe that this second beast will be Jewish. This beast will later be called the false prophet. And so then we read on verse 12, it says, he exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf. This is the false prophet. And made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. So the false prophet is pointing to the Antichrist and making everyone worship the Antichrist, whose fatal wound had been healed. So this character is known as the false prophet and serves as the Antichrist's right-hand guy. He exercises the authority of the Antichrist in carrying out both political and religious duties. Okay. So far, we've seen the Antichrist has formed a one-world government, he's formed a one-world economic system, and now he is forming a one-world religion. Spiritually, the false prophet serves as the head of this one-world religion, seeing to it that everyone worships the Antichrist. And he will amaze and he will deceive the people with his great signs, with all of his miracles, including giving life to a wounded Antichrist. So the Antichrist is wounded, we don't know how, but he's wounded, and the false prophet heals him in front of the people, performs this miracle. Verse 13. And he performed great miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, on behalf of the Antichrist. He deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, we already talked about that, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image, to be killed. So miracles certainly are a sign to the unbelieving, and so Satan is the master counterfeiter, performs enough miracles that people are going to believe, the people are going to follow him. This demonic religious system will consist of people drawn from all over the world, all different religions. And this false prophet will argue in the name of tolerance that there are many roads to God, and God has revealed himself in many religions like Islam and Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and New Age, to name a few. He will tell people that they can pray to whatever God they would like to pray to, as long as they accept the Antichrist as their Messiah. So the false prophet continues to get people to the Antichrist. He continues to point people to the Antichrist just as the Holy Spirit points people to Jesus. You see how he's just trying to mimic everything that God does. Then I also want you to notice the false prophet is the one responsible for administering the Antichrist enforcement system. So we read on, verse 16. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand. Okay, now, I know all of you, I'm sure most all of you have heard of the mark of the beast. Here we're getting into that. So, he's forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. Now, again, I'm confident that most all of you have heard about the mark of the beast. Well, that's what we're seeing right here. He will require that everyone take this number and the number of the beast, 666. So what's the significance of 666? Well, if you've studied much of the Bible, you know that throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, numbers play an important role. For instance, the number 7 is the number of completeness. It's the number of perfection. And this passage we just read tells us that the number 6 is the number of man, or the number of imperfection, or the number of sin. Guys, you could build a $6 million man and it would still fall short of God's perfection. Now, somehow, they're going to mark you with a chip. We don't know exactly how that is going to work, but some type of a radio frequency type identification. When this happens, no one can buy or sell without a chip or a mark on their right hand or their forehead. And since no faithful Christian or believing Jew will take the mark, at this point, all Christians and Jew will be breaking the law, and they're going to be considered criminals. And so they're going to have to hide out in the countryside and live off the land. And they're going to be hunted down like animals. And to be honest with you guys, most of them will end up being killed or martyred for their faith. It'll be a horrible period of unparalleled persecution for those that have become believers during the tribulation period. And, you know, some of you say, well, boy, that scares me, that worries me. If you're a believer, you're not there. Because if you remember, we are raptured out of here before the tribulation period. We're just getting to view what goes on during the tribulation period. Now, again, as we move into the second half of the tribulation, the earth is cursed with the presence of this satanic trinity. The false god is Satan, who has been cast down to earth and cut off from heaven. The false Messiah is the Antichrist, who demands the world's worship. And the false counterpart of the Holy Spirit is the false prophet, whose responsibility is to persuade people to give their allegiance to the Antichrist. So the situation we're seeing here in chapter 13 is bad. But as we move into chapter 14, there is another parenthetical enlargement, another parenthetical pause designed once again to encourage the reader. Because again, he's showing all this stuff in this vision, and he doesn't want us to be discouraged. He wants to keep reminding us that everything will be okay. Verse 1. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, Jesus, standing on Mount Zion, which is basically Jerusalem, which will be the capital of the millennial kingdom. Standing, and we'll talk all about that in a couple of weeks, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. Do you remember them? These are the Jews, the evangelists. And they have some kind of a sign on them to prove they are authentic, to prove they are the true evangelists. And with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So it gives us a glimpse of Jesus standing again on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And while the Antichrist is setting himself up as a god in Jerusalem that demands to be worshiped, the Bible can't wait to let us know, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it, because we win. So you see Jesus and the 144,000 faithful Jews that we saw earlier. Now the remainder of this chapter presents a panoramic preview of what's going to happen during the last half of the tribulation. We're told that an angel will go forth and preach the gospel to every person on the face of the earth. I find that totally amazing. Verse 6, then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. I find that amazing, that even while men are shaking their fist in the face of God and denying God, the Lord is still long-suffering. The Lord is still patient. The Lord is still willing to show his mercy, and this angel continues to preach the gospel to every creature on the face of the earth before God pours out his wrath, which he will. but God is continuing to give them opportunities to repent and to follow him. Do you remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24? He said, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Well, this is the fulfillment of that prophecy right here at the end of the tribulation period. Then we see a second angel is sent forth in verse 8. A second angel followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." We're going to see more of this actually in chapter 17 and in chapter 18, and so I'm going to deal with it in a little bit more depth when we get there. But this angel is saying that Babylon, the end time empire of the Antichrist, that will be his capital, will be destroyed. So the implication of this warning is for everyone to come out of Babylon. We then see a third angel is sent out to warn people that they are not to worship the Antichrist and they're not to receive the mark of the beast, because if they do, they will suffer the wrath of God. Verse 9. A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast, the Antichrist, and his image, and receives his mark, the mark of the beast, on the forehead or on the hand, he too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength." That's really important because, guys, the wrath of God, it is beyond what we can imagine here. And which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. He will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and his image, or for anyone who receives the mark of his name. Please hear me, guys. The pronouncement of this third angel is a terrifying message concerning the final destiny of those that refuse God, of those that rebel against God. Listen, sin is anything. What is sin? The definition of sin literally means to miss the mark. What's the mark? Jesus is the mark. So to miss the mark. Sin is anything that causes us to miss the mark. So sin is anything that stands between us and God. That's different for every one of us. That's different. What's a sin in my life will be different than a sin in your life. So what is it in your life that's causing you to lose focus on Jesus? That's a sin. You need to get rid of those things that whatever it is that's causing you to take your focus off the Lord and to chase after something else is sin in your life, and you need to deal with it. It's anything that comes between us and God. It keeps us away from our relationship with Jesus, and God hates sin for that reason because he wants to be in relationship with you. And so those who refuse God's forgiveness, who choose to practice sin, who make it their lifestyle, must suffer the wrath of God in judgment. But this is what you need to hear me say, guys. Please hear me on this. Hell was never created for mankind. Guys, if you go to hell, it's only because you refuse God's forgiveness. You refused his grace and mercy. So you have to understand the heart of this passage. The heart of Revelation is certainly not God trying to threaten us. That's not what this book is about. The heart of Revelation is for us to see that there's hope.
We're so glad you joined us. This entire message can be found on Northview.tv. Northview is one church with 8 locations, and we would love to have you join us. You'll find service times and a convenient location, again, at Northview.tv. We'll be back next week with another message from Northview. Hope to see you then.